Howdy folks, and welcome to Central Nervous System 6. This is the spinal cord. I think I'm going to do one more video on some of the stuff that I didn't cover in the previous videos. So let's check out our pen. As usual, it works. So here we go. So this is the fifth and final region of the central nervous system. It's the spinal cord, and I'm going to use SC oftentimes for spinal cord, but the spinal cord extends from the medulla oblongata, so up here you can't really see it. This stuff is just the cerebellum, but it extends from the medulla oblongata at the foramen magnum. So remember the foramen magnum, or maybe we haven't covered this yet, but it's an opening in the base of the skull. So foramen, remember that's opening, and then magnum just means large, so it's a large opening at the base of the skull. And then the spinal cord ends at this thing right here. So the spinal cord goes from the medulla all the way down this way, and it ends at this little thing called the conus medullaris between lumbar vertebra 1 and lumbar vertebra 2. Conus medullaris, it just means the cone. So I guess the early scientists that were looking at this thing thought that looked like a cone. So they called the end of the spinal cord the conus medullaris. The spinal cord in general provides a two-way communication to and from the brain, and it contains your spinal reflex centers. So if you've ever gone to the doctor and they tap your knee with that little mallet tapper thing, and then you extend your leg at the knee joint reflexively, you didn't have to have any input go up to your brain to allow you to do this. This just happened through the spinal reflex center. So here's some more details of the spinal cord, and then the spinal nerves too that come out of the cord. So if we look up the top here, there's a cervical enlargement of the spinal cord. So here's the neck area. You can see this guy in the back here. He's kind of shaded. Here's his neck. Here's the cervical enlargement. So you can kind of see where it gets, the cord right here gets a little bit thicker. So it's a cervical enlargement of the spinal cord. And then there's a lumbar enlargement of the cord. Here's the conus medullaris that we talked about. That's the end of the spinal cord. It's the end of the spinal cord, but it's not the end of the spinal nerves, because they continue, the spinal nerves will continue as this structure called the cauda equina, or horse's tail. So all of this area, this is all cauda equina, and the cauda equina, or horse's nerves. The cauda equina, or horse's tail, is made up of nerves. And then there's a structure called the filum terminale, and that's this green thing. So this green thing is made of connective tissue, and it anchors the spinal cord to the coccyx down here. And then, well, to see all this, you have to cut the dura mater and the arachnoid mater of the spinal cord. And then it shows you where the spinal nerves are. So there's the spinal nerves, the cervical spinal nerves are here, thoracic spinal nerves are here, you have lumbar spinal nerves here, and sacral spinal nerves here. Okay, so we talked about the filum terminale. There's 31 pairs of spinal nerves that come out of the spinal cord. And then the cervical enlargement of the spinal cord and the lumbar enlargement of the spinal cord, that's where the nerves serving the upper extremities and the lower extremities emerge from the spinal cord. And then cauda equina, those are just nerve roots coming from the inferior end of the spinal cord. That's the conus medullaris, but they're still within the vertebral canal, so the vertebra that make up the canal. Spinal cord has meninges too, so this is a cross section of the spinal cord and the vertebra. So this is the body of a vertebra. And then you look inside and you can see the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has a dura mater. So that's this thing, this kind of purple thing here. This is all dura mater. And then deep to the dura mater, or tough mother, is the arachnoid mater. And you can kind of see these little white spidery looking things extending from the arachnoid mater. And then the pia mater is the is the deepest part of the spinal meninges, and it's this blue stuff right next to the spinal cord. And then epi, so we're over here, the epidural space. Epi means on top of, so this epidural space contains fat, so it's on top of the dura, or dura mater. And I think when women want pain medication for pregnancy, I think they give them what's called an epidural. So they give an injection here. If there's an epidural space, then there's a subdural space, so below the dura mater. If there's an arachnoid, there's a subarachnoid space, so just below the arachnoid mater there's a space, and that's where the cerebral spinal fluid is. We covered that the last PowerPoint lecture. And then you have these little ligaments here, denticulate ligaments, that help attach the cord to the dura mater. Okay, it looks like that's all there is on this side. So you have the same three meninges as you have in the brain, pia, arachnoid, and dura mater. In the spinal cord, the dura mater has only one layer. In the brain, the dura has two layers. And then we talked about the epidural space, where you give anesthetic injections. This is a cartoon of a lumbar puncture. So you do a lumbar puncture to pull the cerebral spinal fluid from the subarachnoid space in order to test or diagnose different diseases. So if you come over here at the top of the cartoon, you can see we've got like a mid-sagittal, or you could call it a longitudinal section through the spinal column and the spinal cord. And then you look inside, and here's the lumbar needle entering the subarachnoid space to draw CSF. And then I ask, how is a lumbar puncture different from an epidural injection? So the lumbar puncture goes into the subarachnoid space. The epidural injection goes into the epidural space. So this is a cartoon that shows the different types of herniations and bulges of a disc. So here's the spinal cord. Here's the nerves coming out of the spinal cord, a normal spinal cord or an uninjured spinal cord. And then you could have the disc. The disc from the spinal column can bulge centrally. The disc can bulge laterally to the side. And then you can also have a herniated disc that goes through this protective connective tissue, or annulus fibrosis, around the cord. And the way you can take care of that, those herniations, I think you can inject an anesthesia to the inflamed nerve root that's being pressed on. Okay, so let's take a look at the gray matter and the white matter in the spinal cord. So obviously here's the spinal cord. This is a cross section of the spinal cord. This is anterior, so I'll put an A, and then this is posterior back here, so I'll put a P. And you can see that in the spinal cord, the gray and white matter are arranged differently than in the brain. So this is all gray matter, this dark tan stuff. This is all the gray matter that I'm putting a circle around. All gray matter, and then the white matter is superficial to the gray matter. And then, so in the gray matter, you have this area called the gray commissure, and then you have these horns of the gray matter. So I guess somebody thought these looked like horns. So ventrally, so ventral is anterior. So ventrally, this is the ventral horn. So then this would be, back here, this would be the dorsal or posterior horn. And then laterally, these guys are the lateral horns. And you have them on both sides of the gray matter and spinal cord. So you have the dorsal horn, the lateral horn, and the ventral horn. And then this, these are nerves coming out of the spinal cord, and this kind of bulbous projection here is called the dorsal root ganglion. So you're going into the dorsal aspect of the spinal cord, and a ganglion, remember, is a collection of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. So here we are outside of the central nervous system, because remember, the central nervous system is the brain and spinal cord. So out here in the spinal nerve, we're in a dorsal root ganglion. So the collection of cell bodies in here is a ganglion. So the dorsal horns, that's back here, the dorsal horns. There are interneuron cell bodies that will receive sensory input. So the sensory input will come in this way, and that sensory input will go here to the dorsal horns of the gray matter of the spinal cord and send sensory information up to the brain. The ventral horns, so these guys are the ventral horns, that's where somatic motor neuron cell bodies live there, and those axons of the motor neurons will go out to innervate, for example, skeletal muscle. And then you find these lateral horns here, only in thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. And in the lateral horns, you have sympathetic neuron cell bodies. And we talked about the gray commissure. It connects the two halves of the gray matter. And then this circle, this hole right here is the central canal. And the dorsal root ganglia contain cell bodies of sensory neurons. So in this cartoon, it shows the spinal cord in cross section here, and then it's got the gray matter of the spinal cord. So this would be the dorsal horn, this would be the lateral horn, and this would be the ventral horn. Remember, in the dorsal horn, you have interneurons that are synapsing with sensory neurons. In the lateral horn, you have the autonomic nervous system synapses. And then, excuse me, in the ventral horn, you have those the cell bodies of the lower motor neurons going out to innervate a skeletal muscle, for example. So what happens here, you have the somatic sensory neurons and the visceral sensory neurons. So remember that these blue lines, these are the somatic sensory neurons. They're coming from the skin, the joints, or the skeletal muscles. The visceral sensory neurons in green, those are coming from your viscera, so your heart, your intestines, your bladder, for example, and they'll send sensory information about, what you're sensing. So, for example, a full bladder, or you're sensing a pain, so you just pricked your finger, so you've got some pain in your skin. That information will travel via the sensory afferent neurons along their axons, and then the cell bodies of those sensory afferent neurons will live here in the dorsal root ganglia. And then the axons will continue into the dorsal horn of the gray matter of the spinal cord, and then they'll synapse with interneurons, and then those interneurons will send information up to the brain about what you're sensing. So, for example, you just pinpricked your finger, or your bladder is full. And then if you want to send a motor command out, you do that via these motor neurons, which their cell bodies of the lower motor neurons live here in the ventral horn, and they'll send motor information via the axons and action potentials out to, in this case, the yellow motor neuron will go to the viscera. So maybe it'll send information to smooth muscle in your viscera to contract. Or if the information is traveling via a somatic motor neuron, you'll send information out to your skeletal muscle, for example. So I've got here in gold the cell bodies of somatic motor neurons, that's right here, of the spinal nerves are in the ventral horn of the spinal cord, and cell bodies of the visceral motor neurons of the spinal nerves are here in the lateral horn. Now there's some more fun names you can memorize. So here's, in this cartoon, it shows this area here and here. This is a dorsal funiculus. This area would be a lateral funiculus, and then this would be a ventral funiculus. And the funiculus, or the funiculi collectively, those are just where the tracks are running. And the tracks. So remember, tracks are just bundles of axons in the central nervous system. So these funiculi consist mostly of ascending sensory tracks, so axons going up or ascending to the brain, and descending motor tracks, or going from the brain, axons going from the brain through the spinal cord and then out to the periphery. So all these tracks, and they all have names, the tracks all have names, they're located in these three white columns, or Latin is funiculus. And then it doesn't show it in this cartoon, but there are transverse tracks or commissural tracks. I think I showed that in maybe 3 PowerPoints ago. Commissural fibers cross from one side of the spinal cord to the other. And then each spinal tract, and we'll see the names of the spinal tracts in a minute, but each spinal tract is composed of axons of neurons that are carrying similar information to similar locations. So let's say one tract, they might be going out to the lower extremity muscles, for example. And here's the cartoon just with everything filled in. So we've talked about the columns, or the funiculi. So the dorsal, the ventral, and the lateral funiculus. We talked about the gray commissure with the central canal inside. We said that the gray matter has a dorsal horn, a lateral horn, and a ventral horn. We said there's a central canal within the commissure, the gray commissure. We didn't talk about this, but there's when you look at a cross-section of the spinal cord, you'll see this sulcus, and it goes kind of in the middle. So there's a dorsal median sulcus, and then there's a ventral median fissure. So this, because it's called a fissure, it's bigger than the sulcus of the dorsal median sulcus. And then we didn't talk about this yet, but these are spinal nerves. So this is a spinal nerve, and the spinal nerve comes out of the spinal cord. So the spinal nerve starts here with these little guys. They're called rootlets. And then when all the little rootlets coming out of the spinal cord converge, they converge into a ventral root. And then the ventral root exits through the spinal nerve. And then you also have a dorsal, if you have a ventral root, you have a dorsal root here, and then you also have this dorsal root ganglia where the cell bodies of sensory afferent neurons live. Okay, remember I promised you, I'd tell you that the ascending and descending tracts have names, and you don't have to memorize all of them, but I would like you to know the lateral spinothalamic tract that carries information about pain. And this is an ascending tract, so it's going from the periphery, wherever you got pain. So you stuck your finger with a pin and it's painful. It's coming from the periphery or out on your finger, and it's going up the spine, so spino, and it's going into the thalamus. And then from the thalamus, it gets that information about your pain gets relayed up to the sensory cortex. And then these are all names for other ascending tracks. Descending tract, the one I want you to know is the lateral corticospinal tract. So that descending tract is going to start in the cortex. So it's going to start in the cortex. It's going to go down through the spinal cord, and then it's going to go, the motor information traveling in the descending tract will go out to the skeletal muscle, for example. So ascending pathways, this is a cartoon of the ascending, a couple of the ascending pathways. So let's see, let's look at this one, because I think this is going to be on the test. So here, look at this. For some reason, this foot has a flame. Somebody took a match and put it to this foot. And so there's temperature receptors, and there's also pain receptors in your foot. And these are the receptor endings, these little blue endings here. So the information about the heat and the pain will travel along these sensory afferent neurons. So you will actually, let me back up. Here, if you don't detect a temperature change or you don't detect pain, let's say the match is too far away, then you won't get a graded potential here in these receptor endings. So you a graded potential, but in this case it'd be called a receptor potential. But as you move the match closer and closer to your foot, you'll get a graded potential in these little endings here, these neuron endings, and that potential then will, if it's great enough, the heat and pain is great enough, it will turn into an action potential here. So the action potential will travel along the axon of the sensory afferent neuron, and it will continue to travel in the axon, bypassing the cell body of the sensory afferent neuron, which lives here in the dorsal root ganglia. But that information about pain will travel here into this section of the spinal cord, and then the information will cross over, so decussation, and then that information will go up through various parts of the spinal cord till it gets up into the brain, and at that point you will detect the pain. So you have 3 levels of neurons in these ascending pathways. So you have the first order neuron, and so if we look over here, this cartoon shows the first order neuron comes in here and synapses with a second order neuron, and then the second order neuron travels up the spinal cord to a third order neuron, and then the third order neuron will take the information up here to the primary somatosensory cortex. So the second order neuron receives impulses from the first order neuron, yep, and then the second order neuron will be an interneuron in the spinal cord, and its cell body of the second order neuron will be in the medulla oblongata. So for example, in this part of the cartoon, here's the cell body of the second order neuron. It lives in this cross section of the medulla oblongata. And then the second order neuron axons go up to the hypothalamus. So on this cartoon, it's right here. Here's the hypothalamus. And then they'll connect with the third order neurons. Third order neuron is also an interneuron. The cell body of the third order neuron is right here. The axon of the third order neuron is here, and the axon terminal of the third order neuron is here, and it terminates in the sensory cortex. It's interesting to note that tracks that convey life-saving information about what you're sensing to the brain that information travels in posterior spinothalamic tracts. So that information about burning pain, for example, and you should have information that you're burning. So it's life-saving information if you know that some part of your body is burning. So that information will travel in the posterior spinal thalamic tracts. This is just a table that shows the major ascending sensory pathways. So in this column, it gives you the spinal cord tract. So for example, the lateral spinal thalamic tract, its location is in the lateral horn of the cord. Or, sorry, not the horn, it's in the lateral funiculus of the cord. And it tells you over here in this box that the lateral spinothalamic tract transmits impulses or action potentials concerned with pain and temperature. And then that information, remember, those neurons cross over to the other side of the body. So that's decussation. So if there's ascending tracts, then there's descending tracts. This is a cartoon of the descending tract. So in a descending tract, you start up here in the motor cortex, for example, and your first order neuron, you can see it travels through the midbrain, through the pons, through the medulla, and then it crosses over to the other side of the body, decussation, crosses over to the other side of the body, and then it synapses here in the spinal cord with a lower motor neuron, and then that lower motor neuron goes out to skeletal muscles. So in the descending pathway, you have upper motor neurons, and specifically these guys up here, these upper motor neurons are pyramidal cells, and they live in the primary motor cortex. And this is a table that shows the major descending pathways. So for example, the lateral corticospinal tract, it originates in the pyramidal cells of the motor cortex, like I said. And then its function is to transmit motor impulses from the cerebrum to spinal cord neurons. And then those will go out and activate skeletal muscles on the opposite side of the body. And the lateral corticospinal tract is a voluntary motor tract, so it's innervating skeletal muscles. And this just shows the lateral corticospinal tract. So spinal cord trauma can lead to paralysis, so you lose motor function. And then spinal cord trauma can also lead to these paresthesias, and that's just an abnormal sensation or sensory loss. Spinal cord trauma can be a transection. That's a damage across the spinal cord. If it's a complete transection, that could result in total motor and sensory loss in regions that are below the transfection. So if you have a transfection here, you're going to lose motor and sensory information inferior to that where the transection was. A paraplegia, you have a transection between thoracic 1 and L1. So these aren't numbered up here, but the thoracic vertebrae 1 and L1 somewhere here, not numbered. Your paraplegia. If you get a spinal cord transection in the cervical region, then that's quadriplegia. There's a couple different kinds of paralysis. In flaccid paralysis, that's when you damage your lower motor neurons. So that's these guys here. If these are damaged, then an impulse from the motor cortex doesn't reach your muscle. You don't have voluntary or involuntary control of muscles with flaccid paralysis, and your muscles atrophy. A different type of paralysis is spastic paralysis. So if you damage your upper motor neurons, so these guys up here, but the spinal neurons down here, they're still intact, you can have reflex activity. So we'll go over that when we do the peripheral nervous system. But there are reflexes where you can contract your skeletal muscles without a program from the motor cortex. So you don't have any voluntary control of muscles in spastic paralysis, but you're still stimulating your muscles with reflex activity. So you might not have quite the atrophy that you would with flaccid paralysis. So probably everyone's heard of polio. Poliomyelitis destroys the ventral horn motor neurons. So here, the ventral horn of the gray matter. And with that, you get flaccid paralysis in your muscles. Atrophy, you may die from this if you have paralysis of your respiratory muscles, like your diaphragm. I don't know if you've heard of this Lou Gehrig's disease. It's also progressive destruction of these ventral horn motor neurons, and also the fibers of the pyramidal tract, and that's a motor tract serving voluntary movement. So the symptoms, eventually you lose the ability to speak, swallow, and breathe, and typically, I think people can die within 5